All right, what do you guys think? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, well, first, thank you guys for being the stalwarts and being your first panel of the day. Make sure you have your coffee. Hopefully you won't need it, but appreciate everybody being out here for the first presentation. So if you're hopefully you're in the right spot, and if not, just pretend like you are, so I don't need anybody else leaving. But I am Tim Lapetino, yeah, let's jump into this. So disappointing. Like if you were expecting Kirsten Dunst, you are disappointed, and maybe should leave, right? But I'm Tim Lapetino, and I've been writing about pop culture and video games and art for more than a decade. I am the creative director at Atari and the author of a couple books on games like The Art of Atari, Pac-Man, Birth of an Icon, and I've also edited some other books like Sky Captain and the Art of Tomorrow and Undisputed Street Fighter. But also, I've been playing video games since 1982, and I've loved superheroes for almost as long, and I was raised on a diet of comic books, action figures, and cartoons. So the two have always sort of coexisted in my life, really side by side from the beginning. And I'm here talking to you because I sort of believe, this sounds corny, but I believe that pop culture has interesting things to say about what we care about, what we believe, and kind of these threads that run through our daily entertainment lives. And video games that we play here are often like a really interesting reflection of what is going on in pop culture, what's interesting, and all that stuff that we just sort of breathe in and breathe out. So, and also for some reason, the Portland Retro Gaming Expo people keep inviting me back. So there you go. I'm sorry, and you're welcome. But it's hard to remember almost a time when comic books were sort of looked down on and thought of as kind of lowbrow reading. At a time when superhero movies were not Hollywood tentpoles, and when Marvel video games didn't make billions of dollars for the biggest companies on earth. But in this early era, comic books were kind of just that. They were comic books. And in the 70s and 80s, Marvel was just getting its feet wet with live-action adaptations of its characters. And at some level, the company understood that this would be important to sort of grow them into pop culture properties that could live beyond the printed page. So fans got to experience a bunch of different TV and film adaptations that, if we're being generous here, that they don't pack the same modern punch as the modern comic book franchises, right? And so maybe they don't hold up terribly well for today's audiences. But just, from my perspective, just having superheroes appear on the screen was a pretty big deal. So they were out there, and they were out there in the public eye. You had Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby as the two parts of The Incredible Hulk on CBS. You had Nicholas Hammond and his stunt double donning the tights as Spider-Man. You had Red Brown as the Captain America. But then also Doctor Strange and Thor and Daredevil eventually made appearances. And plenty of other heroes kind of came close, but no cigar. And I think these things were really important as video games really came on the scene, because it signaled to these video game companies and places like Marvel that there was an opportunity for this like cross-media interest in their characters beyond just these monthly comics. Right? So today I wanted to walk you through some of those very first steps and kind of what it looked like when developers tried to work with Marvel and bring these characters to things like computers, consoles, arcades, and handheld screens. And by the way, these are amazing photos. Like I love some of the stuff. It's really intriguing to see like the very first efforts of what you could do in the pre-digital era with these heroes. And people look at this and they're like, oh my gosh, that was actually a thing. It absolutely was a thing. And generally we loved it, right? I speak for myself at least. And before we get too deep into this, I wanted to, this talk is about the Bronze Age of comics, which is, typically it's considered somewhere between 1970 and 1985. And today, for the sake of this presentation, and because I get to do what I want, I'm kind of playing it a little fast and loose there. So we'll go a little longer, maybe we'll start a little bit later. But this era really is typified by not just so much what it is, but what it isn't, right? Comic history is sort of broken out into the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Silver Age was the one that came right before the Bronze Age, that makes sense. But that was really like that era from like the mid-50s through the whole decade of the 60s was really kind of ground zero for the birth of Marvel Comics, who sort of brought in, superheroes were not new. but they brought in this unusual approach to superheroes, this sort of offbeat, kind of down on your luck heroes with actual real problems set in actual real places. You know, this whole approach that really kicked off a big chunk of that alongside some of the things that DC Comics were doing. So in sort of exploring these, there's a whole bunch of different games, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but I kind of wanted to break them down by character and property, because I think that's interesting, the thing about these in terms of how do you treat these different characters across the decade and across this time, but also, this isn't Comic-Con after all, right? So I don't want people to get super confused. If you don't know your Daredevil from your Dazzler, that's totally fine, that's okay. So let's just jump in, right? And I think the big thing here is Spider-Man is kind of the rock star of Marvel Comics, right? One of the most recognizable characters, one of the most interesting backstories. That's a great shirt, by the way. That is, he really is the stalwart, and even in the 70s and 80s, Spider-Man was the most recognizable Marvel character. And I think it's really interesting because Spider-Man is kind of ripe for this sort of transition into comics because he's got an unusual costume, he's got an interesting power set, he visually, dynamically does different things, right? He doesn't just punch people, which he does a lot of punching, but it's about swinging and it's about webs and all this stuff, so I think very much you see, okay, Spider-Man is going to be the first. So we have to begin somewhere here, right? And if you want to get technical, maybe these aren't video games, but these are the Bandai made these electronic marvels, these electronic games, and these have a lot more in common with things like the little Mattel handheld football of that era, but not fun, right? You've got, they're not, with all apologies, they're not fun. You've got little LED lights and you've got little switches on the side, and they really tried super hard to make a game out of this, right? But it's very, very simple. There's not a lot of interactivity, but even the choice of the artwork in here I think is really intriguing because they're trying to tell a little bit of a story. Obviously, you've got this big Spider-Man. Are you holding his hands? Are you fighting with him? It's a little unclear. But I think these are funny. You take these very first halting steps, and I say this all very respectfully, right? You only know what you know, right? But I think it's really interesting that maybe this wasn't really powerful in terms of repeat gameplay, but it's a good grounding for the kind of things that were happening in this era. This is 1978. Right, so but it's really interesting. You pick up this product, it looks like Spider-Man, right? And that's super important. I think it's really important, and keep that in mind as we go farther here. So one of the first Spider-Man, sort of video game, uses here is this, Amazing Spider-Man pinball, right? So if you know pinball, if you're into pinball at all, you know that the company Gottlieb made some really impressive pinball games, and this one is great looking. Now, I will say this, not only am I a terrible pinball player, but I'm also somewhat ignorant of what makes a great pinball game, because I'm terrible at all of them. So I just assume it's always my fault. So I can't really comment on the quality of this, is the playfield designed well, I don't know. But it's a great looking machine, the art is really interesting, and apparently Stan Lee had one of the first machines that came off the assembly line, and he had it for years in his Marvel office, and he used to say that people would come into his office just to play Spider-Man pinball and beat him at it. So I feel okay, at least I'm in kind of good company. The guy co-created Spider-Man, so that's not so bad. But I think the really interesting thing here is that the back glass, right, is that back panel, and then the playfield art were done by this really great artist, Gordon Morrison, who not only had this legendary run of pinball artwork, he could do all these different styles. He really did an interesting job. You see here, he's kind of trying to ape, sort of the late 60s Marvel style Spider-Man, but also he's one of the guys, and people don't know this, and this is something I just discovered when I was working on Pac-Man, this Pac-Man book, was he was the one we think did the Midway Pac-Man cabinet art for the arcade machine. He was kind of moonlighting with Midway. So that's fun, and I like to connect everything to Pac-Man, so. So let's jump forward a little bit, right? Okay, so we get to 1982, and this is, whether you love or hate it, this is kind of a classic of the genre. This is Spider-Man on the Atari 2600 by Parker Brothers, right? And the 2600 in and of itself is not a super powerful machine in the sense that it's not able to generate complex background scenes and really immersive environments, at least not in 1982. You know, there's definitely been, people have some advances of what they can squeeze out of the system. But if you're looking at creating a game that has sort of the signature elements of Spider-Man with the game, you could do worse than this, right? You've got web slinging of skyscrapers, you've got bombs, you've got bad guys, and you've got the Green Goblin. All that sort of essential iconography is still there. You know, and I think this is really, really important. As you see this through line, we're going to go through like sort of the technological spectrum, and certain things keep popping up, right? You know, what are the things, if you have this teeny tiny little screen with these super low resolution graphics, whether you're talking about this or you're talking about the Game Boy, what are the things that you have to have? You know, what are the must-haves for the design of Spider-Man? You know, and I think it's about web slinging, it's about having the character, it's about New York City, like, you know, it's about skyscrapers. I think those things are super interesting that we keep coming back to because they're an essential element of the pack, you know, Spider-Man storytelling. So, you know, in this version, Spider-Man's webbing doesn't stick to windows, which seems like a really like major fail, especially if they're going to be, you know, swinging around the rooftops. You know, I blame Mr. Clean. I mean, that's probably really, you know, there should be like some kind of like, you know, boss fight there. But, you know, so like you're Spider-Man, you're climbing vertically and diagonally, you're shooting your webs and you're swinging around and you're trying to get to the top of the skyscraper and sort of get past the Green Goblin. You're not even really like boss fighting. Like it's really just, he's another thing to get through. But it also seems like Peter Parker has not sold that many photos as a Daily Bugle because you run out of webbing quickly, right? And you know, that's what's kind of crazy if you're not smart about it. You go very quickly into this, right? You know, this gruesome fall to your death. And then one of you played this game, and I wish I set this up for sound, you make this splat. You know, and it's like, that is like the worst and most ignominious way for Spider-Man to die. No, I fell. I'm a guy who swings from rooftops, and I fell and died. But I mean, on the angle of like, you know, 2600 games, like that's pretty gruesome. Like it's kind of awesome. But so that is a great thing. I think something else that's really interesting and I kind of dig is like sort of the approaches taken to advertising this game. And you can see this is the difference between a US and a UK advertising campaign. Is that US, they have this whole thing that I'll get to in a second. But the UK is like very much straightforward. Like, you know, you see a lot of these steps in this early marketing because people are still sort of defining what video games are. And it's not assumed that everybody understands video games, so sometimes they're very literal. It's like, well, it's a video game about Spider-Man. Wait, what do you mean? Well, we better show Spider-Man playing the game, right? You know, there's this really sort of on-the-nose quality to that, which I think is super important to think about. And it just shows you how much video games have sort of been absorbed into our pop culture. We just take it on, you know, on faith, and we take it, obviously, that there's a lot of assumptions already being made. But also, I think it's really fun. In the United States, Parker Brothers had this really consistent look and feel of their games and their advertising, you know, even across properties and licenses. I mean, they had Star Wars and Spider-Man and Frogger, and yet the advertising, they kind of looked the same. Like, all the boxes had a similar look to them. They were silver. The cartridges had a shared shape. And this is really interesting. I like this because, you know, I do a lot of work, and I have done a lot of work in licensing, right? So working with Marvel and Star Wars, let me just say, this kind of stuff would absolutely not fly today, right? This, you know, we call this like in-world and real-world. Like, okay, they mix these things. Like, there's a guy that's not Peter Parker, but he's wearing a Spider-Man suit, and you got some dentist or whatever, you know, like wielding a lightsaber. But I think it's actually really fun. Because, one, these have a consistent look and feel, right? You got the same typography, you got the same layout, you got the same approach, so when you see different ads, you still get it. But at the same time, this blending, this would never get approved today. I mean, like, they're sort of operating in the same quote-unquote real world between Spider-Man, Frogger, and Star Wars. But that's kind of what I love about this era. There's like this Wild West quality to it. You know, and as this real time, you can see in real time, they're kind of figuring this out before this becomes this super slick marketing machine, right? Where you just insert IP and then out comes your, you know, everything that kind of looks the same. So I think that's pretty fun. All right, this one's kind of an oddity. This is a little bit of history. This is actually a text-based adventure game, and you'll see this some of these awkward naming conventions as companies try and own the game, but also not try and own the property. So this is called Quest Pro, featuring Spider-Man, or starring Spider-Man, and it's a text adventure, right? It's sort of got visual screens, but basically it's a text game. And you're in there exploring, and you would type in things like Spider-Man, open this door, look for this. And this is actually the second game in a series. The first one featured the Hulk. The first one was limited to sort of 2-word commands, Hulk smash, which actually totally works for the character, right? But Spider-Man, this was much more sophisticated, and it could even accept full, complete sentences. And so this Spider-Man has to solve different puzzles and encounters different villains. You've got the Lizard, even Madam Web shows up. So we'll shout out to Sydney Sweeney if anybody's seen that incredible movie. But this is a lot more of an artifact of its time rather than something that you'd want to probably pick up and play today. But I think it's also, just as a side note, we're talking very low resolution graphics, and a lot of these are even coming on PCs that have 4 colors, 8 colors, 16 color monitors. And it's really, in design, we call this perceptual color. I mean, if you look at that bottom right screenshot, there's no red there, right? But they're using purple and they're using these other colors to sort of suggest this idea. And if you know the colors of Spider-Man, you get an idea of this. Now, it's not actual, but they're trying to use perceptual color to squeeze as much as they can out of these CGA monitors. This one is actually this is The Amazing Spider-Man. Again, we're going back to it's either some weird construction of a title or it's just called Spider-Man, right? This is a game done by Paragon Software, and I love this when I was a kid. Granted, we were hungry for any kind of Spider-Man video game, but in this one, Mysterio captures Mary Jane, and you have this little bitty Spider-Man that has to navigate all these levels. I will say, you start to see some sort of synergy here happening, because they are capitalizing on the popularity of Todd McFarlane, who's a super popular Spider-Man artist of the time. And you notice that's on the packaging art. That's even in the this title screen, which is really awesome considering that is a 6-color screen. That's 6 colors. And again, we're going back to this perceptual color. They're doing the best they can with this limited palette, and it still looks pretty good. I mean, there's some really pretty dope pixel art as we go through here. And so this game, is mildly fun as a kid, but it's kind of slow. But you notice, if you can see, especially you guys all the way in the back, Spider-Man is tiny. He's the Amazing Spider-Mite or something. But in the development of the game, the brief change, they went from going to a beat 'em up to a platformer, and they said, you know what, we really want to showcase Spider-Man swinging, so we need more space. We need, space to show him swinging around and stuff. But I mean, my goodness, look at how small these little characters are. I mean, if you can swing your eyes, that's Mary Jane. You can see, and she's worried, if you can tell. She's super nervous. I'm just kidding, you can't tell that. It's 2 pixels. But, also one of the weirdest things in this is the health bar. So you got your screen on the left, but that thing on the right gets this really nice, super not action-oriented picture of Spider-Man standing inert. But he's your health meter. So as you lose more life, Spider-Man starts to get replaced by this spider skeleton. It's almost like Peter Parker's slowly getting eaten by flesh-eating bacteria or something. But I mean, it's iconic, and I very much remember this. And it's one of those things that this is a choice. This is an interesting design choice. But again, it's fun to see this stuff. So this is Spider-Man versus the Kingpin. This is across multiple platforms, including the Sega CD platform. And here we take a big jump here, right? Because now 1990, we're a little bit out of the Bronze Age, but you know what? Whatever, it's my talk, I'll do what I want. But the idea here is that Spider-Man is framed by the Kingpin and has 24 hours to defuse a bomb in New York City. Again, very light storytelling, right? There's villain fights and there's a timer where you have to find a way to defuse your bombs. But I mean, look at the graphical step here. Now we're really not just trying to get something to actually look like Spider-Man. Now we actually have a take on Spider-Man in terms of, we're aiming at a certain style of art. And if you know comic book art, this looks pretty heavily influenced by something in between Todd McFarlane and Rick Leonardi, right? So there's a real look here, and already the graphics are, bounced up another level, right? And you can see that, it's pretty cool, really interesting. You've got much larger sprites, you've got much larger characters, the environments, you see a lot of depth and interest there, which is actually really fun. This is an interesting one this is called Spider-Man the Video Game. It's well, what what were all the other ones before that? They were not really, this is Spider-Man, the real video game, but this is an arcade machine, right? Made by Sega. And this one's pretty cool because it starts this trend of Spider-Man, and I like to call it Spider-Man in the kitchen sink, right? Because not only do we have Spider-Man, he's not just like beating up hooligans, right? You have like multiple enemies, and you got popular and classic villains from the comics. You got Kingpin, Lizard, Green Goblin, even Venom. You think about this, this is 1991. Venom hasn't been around for super long, but already he's super popular, and video game makers are realizing, oh, the kids these days, they love Venom, right? So we got to get Venom in there, right? And so this arcade machine's awesome because it's a huge 4-player machine, and you can switch characters at any point. And if you ever get a chance, like this is a great game. Galloping Ghost out in Brookfield, Illinois, right outside Chicago. They have one of these. It's very, very cool. But you look at this, like now the main characters are super large on the screen, which is pretty cool, right? Like there's really nice detail in the sprites, and it looks really good. But also, there's some odd choices here. Like you can pick one of 4 people to be, right? One character to play. You've got Black Cat. Okay, that makes sense. She's kind of this villain and this love interest. But why are, Submariner and Hawkeye, like, they really have almost no Spider-Man connection. It feels a little bit like a random choice, but, without any sort of inside knowledge. I feel like it's either driven by licensing availability, or they say, hey, we need different power sets, right? We need different characters with different silhouettes who are going to do different things, and that's going to drive the game, even if it's not driving the storytelling. So that's kind of but I mean, that's like a really cool piece of art. Like that's really fun, just straight up. And again, if anybody's worked in this area of like trying to create really demonstrative, beautiful pixel art, I mean, that's right up there. And then just interesting that there's a little bit of a disconnect in the marketing, because you saw this really expressive sort of 90s looking Spider-Man, but then in the flyer art in these, they're pulling back to what probably is just licensing art from Marvel, right? So now this more looks like stuff that came out in the 70s and 80s. Could they have done something different? Probably, but that's very noticeable. All right, we're getting towards the end of Spider-Man here. Spider-Man 2, this is interesting. The main thing I want to point out here is that it's got chock full of villains, lots of characters, Venom, but also this is an early appearance of Carnage, who is a spin-off Venom character who gets super popular, like right off the bat. And it's just really interesting that he's super facing, front forward in all the advertising, even if it's not a huge part of the game. Like, and that art right there from Spider-Man 2, that's right from the comics, right? And that's drawn by a popular artist of the time as well, Mark Bagley, which I think is interesting. So, but again, I talked about this before. I think there's this huge focus on environments, right? Again, it's clear that, maybe this is an alley, maybe it's something, but it's New York or it's some kind of city, right? And the idea is like, New York is an important character in the Spider-Man universe. Maybe even more important, is there another character besides maybe Batman and Gotham City, that like those two are absolutely linked and you can't really have one without the other? And I think when you're thinking about how do you boil down storytelling to 160 by 164 pixels, that's the Game Boy display, like, you gotta go with the essentials, right? And they're clearly doing that here. All right, this one's fun. This is totally outside of the Bronze Age blast radius, but I think it's fascinating. So this is another Venom and Carnage game, and this is ripped right from a comic storyline of like 92. Now this is 94, right? And they basically just took this storyline and brought it in. But you've got everybody in here that kind of reads like a who's who of characters that are popular at the time. But the big thing is like, okay, Carnage is absolutely front and center here. And it's really fun. I have like a goofy story. Like this is where you start to see more synergy. The kind of comedy punk band Green Jelly wrote the music for this, and they did a song. It's called Carnage Rules, and it's like this Carnage Rules, and it's like this really like kind of badass hardcore sort of sound. But as a promotional item, the company would give away these cassette singles. Remember cassette singles had like 2 songs on them? And I had one of these, as a kid in my car. So one day I'm like, my brother and I stopped to get tacos at Taco Bell, and I'm like, let's put in like Carnage Rules. And so we're rocking out, and I'm speeding, and I get pulled over by the cops, like literally while I'm eating Taco Bell taco. And I'm clearly getting a speeding ticket while, Carnage Rules is still like blasting on our stereo. And my mom pulls up, right? And my mom, and not only does she drive by, she stops And she's like, wow, officer, what's going on? I'm like, okay, this wasn't embarrassing enough before, now it's like super embarrassing. But anyway, we still talk about that around the dinner table and family things. Let's talk about the Hulk a little bit. Right now you see that was a bunch of games, right? And we can go even deeper into the Spider-Man canon. Now we start to get a little bit of diminishing returns on these other characters who are not quite as like A-listers. But the Incredible Hulk. Lou Ferrigno, Bill Bixby, like this live action, this guy who's non-CG and I'm sure not chemically enhanced, bodybuilder, and Lou Ferrigno. And this was very much for many, many, many years beyond the time when this was, no longer these things were on reruns. This is an indelible version of the character. But I think it's really interesting because of licensing and the way those things work. That version of the character is not owned by Marvel. It's owned by CBS or Viacom, whoever owns them now. But it's interesting, you don't see any sort of one-to-one, right? So you see different versions of the Hulk, like that, again, Hulk escapes. We're trying very hard to make these interesting, right? They're giving them good verbs. But we've also got like the Hulk Quest Probe. And one thing I didn't mention before about this is that there was supposed to be a whole slew of these games, and the company like ran into financial. But that's Scott Adams, who really was kind of a pioneer in the space of these text adventure games. And I think they saw this as a natural and interesting way to sort of tie these things together. And also like these Quest Pro games came with these like little mini comics, right? So they were trying really hard to tie the comics together. And I think that's interesting because this is a struggle a little bit for these comic-based video games to get out of the comic book world, right? I mean, obviously they're comic characters, so they're going to be based on comic looks and stuff, but we start seeing the things like panels and pages and all that stuff, like, some of this is technology and some of it is just like mental thoughts about like, how do you tell a story about these characters without referring to the iconography in comics? And this is something that video games struggle with for a while. But again, this version of this game works really well because Hulk fall, Hulk hit rock, like that. These are actual like legitimate things you could do in this game, and today we would say that's very on brand, for that character. This one's kind of fun. So this is actually a game that was never released, and this is a little mystery. And some of the reason why I like talking about this is this game's probably floating out there. So this was an announced game for Parker Brothers, and it was never released. So, but boxes have shown up that were like promo boxes, screenshots. This comes from a catalog. It has a whole strategy like baked in. They talk about the play of the game, that you're basically Bruce Banner and you're trying to get through here and not turn into the Hulk, which I think is really interesting because it does sort of tie back to the show, this idea that the Hulk is this curse, right? He doesn't just like, hey, I'm just gonna rock out and turn green and smash stuff. Like the idea is he's trying to get rid of this thing. So like a game based around this premise that you're trying not to turn into the Hulk, one, that sounds super not fun. But two, like I think it's really interesting that like there's this little bit of pathos going on here. So there's screenshots and we have a game description, but no one has found a prototype. So if you're out there looking, if you're in the thrift stores or whatever, like somebody find this game, let's check it out. Because I would really like to play that. I think it'd be interesting. All right, Captain America. Come on. I mean, that is an epic costume with a matching motorcycle. So like, the interesting thing about Captain America's games is that they sort of reflect his standing in pop culture at the time. Now, everybody knows Captain America. He's a pop culture icon, he's recognized worldwide. But in the Bronze Age, not so much outside of comic books, right? But it wasn't for lack of trying. Like in the late 70s, you had 2 TV movies starring Reb Brown, who was most known as a football player. They're not amazing. Like, they're not really great, but the best thing you could say about one of these is like, you had like Christopher Lee as a villain in one of these. I watched these, I don't know if I could heartily recommend them, but they're interesting for this like 70s take. One thing I do like is you see he's got his shield mounted to the front of the motorcycle, which was totally a Captain America kind of thing. But you notice it's clear. And it's clear because the Highway Patrol would not let the stuntman, I'm assuming, drive this thing around without being able to see through that thing when he's bent down. So like, oh, okay, you just decanonized the Captain America shield and now it's made of plexiglass. But that's awesome. It's fun. And there was another low-budget Cannon Films movie that was supposed to be released in 1990. But the problem was, that 1989, another really big movie came out. And what was that? That was Batman, right? It totally reset, reset the bar and ruined the grade curve for movies like this. So they kind of held on to the film and then they went direct to video, right? And probably rightly so. Let's just say that. But Captain America's appearances in video games were much more about being part of a team, right? But I mean, again, we come back to this weird naming thing. This game is called Captain America in the Doom Tube of Dr. Megaloman. That's amazing. I don't know what a Megaloman is, but I want it. And I think that like this should be the title of the new Marvel movie with Robert Downey Jr. Like this is just fun stuff. But again, like look, we've got like the iconography of panels and comic books all throughout this stuff. But there's some cool stuff in here. I mean, like this is a splash screen from this. And yes, maybe there's some questionable typographic things happening here. Like the A is, tied into America, and then whatever, there's the name of the company. But like, that's some great pixel art. I mean, it's a dynamic image, it's interesting, and it's very much Captain America. The rest of the game, it has a lot of detail in it. There's a lot of stuff that's taken up by all the things you have to track in this game. But it's interesting. And then, I don't know if you can read that from back here, but on screen it says 2 zaps to kill a Megadwarf. That's my next band name, if I ever had a band name. I mean, it's just kind of awesome. But again, you see like very much we've got all the tropes of comics here, right? And we're not walking away from it. Another game, again, super long title. This is The Amazing Spider-Man and Captain America and Dr. Doom's Revenge. We're trying to put all the star power in the name. And yeah, maybe this could be a Spider-Man game. It kind of is, but I'm putting in Captain America because he's kind of lonely. So this came with a comic book that was a pack-in comic, so it kind of set up the storyline. But as quickly as you go into this, and I actually owned this as a kid, I thought it was really fun, but we only had a CGA monitor which could display 4 color bits, which is like 16 colors. And I would go over to my friend's house and it looked so much better on his computer, right? Because I didn't have a sort of a purple and teal Spider-Man. But, it's really interesting. Some of this art is great, some of it's maybe not quite as great, but like, I think that we're talking about this, is they're straddling this line and trying this way to directly map to comic books. But actually, I think it really hurts, users because if you want to read a comic book, just read a comic book. Comic book artists intuitively know how to tell a story visually, what to leave in, what to leave out, because you're not drawing every single action, right? But you're knowing how to take people from A to B, storytelling. Whereas this is sort of using the visual device of a comic book, but it's not really telling a story. It's just like, random things happen to Captain America. Here we go, he fights the rhino, now there's a monkey. Like there's all these sort of things. I mean, they look really nice, but you see that they're not hiring comic book artists to do this work, right? And again, if this sounds like I'm pooping on it, I'm not. Like, but it's something to note, like, very much they're wrestling with, they're struggling in some ways with the limitations, but it's not just graphical and visual limitations, it's really about storytelling limitations. So they're nice, but simple. Also, this is interesting, I stole this from somebody, but it's interesting to see on these different platforms how the artists are having to tackle the technical limitations and basically still tell the same game story. This is very cool. Unfortunately, I don't have to look at who did this, but it's really interesting to see it's still Spider-Man, and like they're really tackling this from a game art perspective. How do we make sure that like we have a somewhat consistent approach across these platforms? And then this is the end, and you fail, and it's like, oh, good job. I mean, not only is this like a nice piece of pixel art, but it's kind of dark. It's like, okay, sorry, you're not going to try and save the day again. Kind of has like a little bit of like the Missile Command feel to it. Yep, the end. You're done. So the best known of these, and yeah, I hear some people know this game, Captain America and the Avengers. This is an awesome sort of 4-player beat 'em up, and it's kind of a classic in the genre. It has an Avengers roster that sort of mirrors the team that was out in comics and popular there. You can see like the white version of the Vision. You got the Hawkeye, but also kind of interesting. I mean, we're talking 1991 here. You don't have any main characters who are females. No Scarlet Witch, Mockingbird. All options there, and you obviously see this changes, just a couple years later. But there's also a 2-player version of this game that's pretty fun. But the 4-player one, if you get the opportunity to play it, it's pretty great. Just really cool looking stuff, a lot of fun. Then we start to get into sort of like a really strong period of games like these, tied into superheroes from companies like Data East and Capcom and whatnot. So we really start to say, hey, you know what, we're going to start dropping like some of the requirements. Well, hey, is it my talk or yours? Let's go. I totally lost my trick. Thanks a lot, Siri. Just the idea that like they don't feel hamstrung by the conventions of comic books. They're really thinking about like the energy and the emotion, the action of these characters, and that becomes like a sort of a front-facing part of video games based on comics. So super cool. Some more screens here. I mean, just really dynamic and really thinking about scene making and really just capturing the energies using these sort of cutscenes or interstitials to really make these feel epic, right? Because you're really just you're just beating up throughout this game. The backgrounds help, but these moments, like these sort of big moments, really like drive home the point. And there's just some cool stuff. This is the way things like the flyers get depicted, and that's how it looks. There's also a one-player Game Boy version. I think this is also interesting. Totally different kind of art, right? And like pretty intense, like fully painted. Looks really good, but not a whole lot of consistency, which is also a fun thing. You get different takes on the art by different artists, and that helps define platforms, right? This is not the arcade game, but we want you to sort of feel like it's the arcade game, but this is something cooler and different, and maybe even a little more metal, right? And this is funny because this is not the way you would handle it today. Today you'd say, okay, we're going to do this across all modern platforms, same key art, same look and feel. We actually want to minimize differences because we want everyone to feel like everything's the same. Now this is something interesting because working at Atari, at least for like our old school games, I do want to do those. We do some of this stuff where we say, hey, you know what? We want to create different versions of art. We want to like capture a little bit of that Wild West thing. But also, it's just another opportunity to get a different look and a different feel out there into the world. And we like seeing the way artists can reinterpret these characters. Like, I don't remember who did this art, but it's not one of the, like, the who's who of comic book artists, which is kind of fun. The Punisher. All right. In the late 70s, the Punisher comes out as sort of this anti-hero in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man. But as we get into the 80s, he gets super popular as this rise of sort of dark, gritty anti-heroes really becomes popular. And comic artist Jim Lee later on becomes a superstar in X-Men, but he really kind of cuts his teeth on the Punisher. And that helps put not only the comic, but also the characters right in the spotlight, and video games follow. Now, also there's this New World Pictures low-budget attempt to bring this to screen with Dolph Lundgren from Rocky IV. He dyed his blonde hair, and they really tried to do like a legit effort here, but it's low budget, it's kind of gritty, it's like pretty seriously R. But then also, it comes right before, right as Batman is getting released. So what happens, again, they shelf it, and it goes direct to video only in the United States. This one may be worth watching, it's on the bubble. It's interesting. Although there are no skulls, they were like, nah, that's not serious, nobody wears a skull on the chest. So there's no skulls on the chest, which is kind of like, but even the game, this game this is the NES, this is one of the very few NES rail shooters. It has Jim Lee art on it, so obviously they're like, oh, Jim Lee. At this point, Jim Lee has sort of moved to X-Men, right? But they're like, hey, we're going to use Jim Lee art because people connect those two people. So they're thinking about this, at least in some loose terms. And this is one of the very few NES rail shooters. Kind of cool, pretty violent also, which I think is it's worth noting for this era. And then you've got another game. This is sort of it's not a sequel because it's sort of a slight reimagining of the same game for the Game Boy, but they're like, well, maybe the Punisher needs a little help. Let's bring Spider-Man in here. Again, like, hey, let's bring the Ringer in, right? Everybody loves Spider-Man. But does Spider-Man like it when, the Punisher is killing, like, Colombian drug lords? Not really. Like, that doesn't really work from a story perspective. But, they did this. This is interesting because it is a rail shooter, one player on Game Boy, which is also kind of unusual. But again, why isn't Spider-Man showing up like, hey, Punisher, don't kill people? But that's probably what would happen. So we've seen the Punisher, we talked about this sort of idea of cameo city, where you're bringing in all these other heroes This is a Punisher, and this game's not as well known, but it's actually like critically, I think people like it. This is the arcade game, right? Done by Capcom, and you just kill a lot of people, right? And then they brought in Nick Fury, who's the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I think this is an interesting choice because, again, they're sort of suggesting that there's this larger universe, even though, one game to the next, these things, there's no continuity here. I just think, it feels like there's this concern that narratively, maybe a single character is not going to be able to carry the whole thing. Or maybe there's like, hey, it's fun fan service. That's fine. And these are just kind of cool. Like, just some really nice artwork. And I mean, if you were wondering how violent it is, like super violent. Like there's, and I have a feeling that there's some larger versions of this where like, there's even more blood. I mean, if you look, you can, we're on a small screen, but yeah, the Punisher's doing what the Punisher does. X-Men. All right, well, we're kind of winding down here. We got a couple more minutes, but X-Men. All obviously 80s and into the 90s, X-Men was the thing, and this is for a brief time. X-Men really starts to eclipse Spider-Man. But the takes here, I think, are really intriguing, and from a design perspective, I also really am into this. So Wolverine gets his own NES game, right? This is in 1991. And I think it's funny because if you look at this box art, it's this great picture of Wolverine. It's like really neat, looks ripped right from the comic books. And then they're like, oh, what if some kid's mom doesn't know that this is an X-Men game? We gotta make sure we say X-Men on there. So if you can read that, it's like, X-Men starring Sabretooth. Well, okay, what's a Wolverine? It's like, that's what my mom would say, right? So this is like we call this a packaging violator, right? And we have this really kind of lame little thing. It's like, this is a scene of the X-Men with his friend Sabretooth. But, that's a marketing thing. It's just funny, like, working in that era, it's like, okay, we're going to sell this thing, right? But, it's an interesting game. Surprise, it's your old friend Sabretooth. Right? Just in case you weren't sure, like, it's an X-Men game. But really, it's an interesting platformer. It's kind of fun. Wolverine's got claws. But this is sort of the granddaddy right here, right? This is the X-Men arcade game, Konami from 1992. There's two versions of this arcade game. One is a 4-player version, and then there's a 6-player version. This thing is massive. I believe that there's one of these here on the arcade floor. So after this, don't go see anybody else's panel except maybe Howard's because he's sitting right back there. Go play this. It's epic. It's 6 players. It's got a double wide screen, so there's literally 2 separate screens back there. And from my friends who own arcades, they say this game is horrible to maintain. It's very difficult to maintain. The sound is difficult. The screens, getting them to match, it's really tough. But it is a super fun game. I mean, just belling up to an arcade game with 5 other people is like super, super fun. And you just see this like great looking art, really cool stuff. And the interesting thing is they weren't like dialing into the comics. They were actually dialing into an animated show. It was going to be called, and they only made 1 pilot episode. It's called Pride of the X-Men. And this was done by Marvel and Toei, and they were hoping to launch this into a series. And it's like really well done, the animation's great, but the character designs come right from the TV show, right? So they borrow some things from the comics, but very much like this all comes straight out of this cool cartoon, which I think is really good. And my hot take is this is way better than the 90s X-Men series that we saw. Fight me after, that's fine. But like really, really well done. It feels more 80s than it feels 90s, but just really, really neat looking stuff. And like the design work, I mean, we talked about synergy, and now very much like these two feel very much of a piece, but unfortunately the animated series doesn't go anywhere. So like nobody knows that. It's not connected in that way. But you even see, like even the original Japanese art that's made for like the arcade flyers and stuff feels based on the cartoons themselves, right? It has a different look, but it's like really, really well executed. A couple more things, we got 2 more minutes. And we can take a couple questions if you guys have time. I put this game in the X-Men bucket because the poor X-Men just don't have a lot of games at this time. But, this is very much, again, that whole kitchen sink approach where it's like, okay, we like Spider-Man, but we also like the X-Men. Let's put them in there. And then let's put some other characters, like this guy, Arcade, whose name is Arcade, but this is not an arcade game, it's actually a console game. And the marketing people, why didn't you guys get involved with this? Because it's super confusing. You've got Carnage, you've got everything in there, right? So you've got really neat stuff here. But it's interesting because this is very clearly, if you know comics, you see like these images are pulled right from some pretty famous and iconic images. But they're like 80% right? And that's kind of weird. I mean, Gambit just looks scared to be here. But, it's interesting. Again, you see this sort of back and forth. And we get other fun things, like we have one Silver Surfer game, which, that's a beautiful piece of art. It's really well done, but I think Silver Surfer, that's how he feels about his game as well. He's just sad, defeated. And then one more, just because we can. Howard the Duck. Howard, any love for Howard the Duck? Yeah, all right. Very first Marvel live-action movie. Full stop, right? So Howard's the first. Maybe it's not a great game or a great movie, but voted worst film of the year at the Golden Raspberry Awards. But hey, you know what? Now Howard is in the MCU, so I'm sure we'll see more of this. Really, that's. If that's not creepy, I don't know what to tell you, right? But it's kind of amazing, But they're trying super hard. They're trying to tie it right into this unfortunate movie, in many ways. So real quickly, were there any other missed opportunities? I mean, that's a lot of video games, and we kind of scratched the surface. There are more. But, my thinking is, could they have done more transmedia? And there's a couple things that I wish would have happened. One, we had a Thor and a Daredevil. I would love to see, this version of the characters in a video game. I mean, come on. If that's not amazing, I don't know what does. Or could we have seen the Roger Corman Fantastic Four video game? I mean, this is Marvel's first family and last. Has there ever really been a good Fantastic Four movie? They've tried. But I would have paid folding money to see this. And then of course, come on. This is a real thing. David Hasselhoff was Nick Fury. It was a made-for-TV Fox thing in 1998. But come on, really, this would just be a gateway drug to Baywatch the video game. Yeah. That's really what we all want. And finally, this is just me because this is my talk. I can say whatever I want. There was going to be a She-Hulk movie with Bridget Nielsen. I don't know what. I can't even explain any of this, except that, it ties in because she was the wife of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. So we've got that whole Dolph Lundgren connection. But I would have liked to see this movie, and I would have loved to see a video game on it. So anyway, that is that. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.